Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael, on a Wednesday evening, doing a quick stream here because we have another one coming up in about 30 minutes where we're going to be doing a conversion story from Orthodox Presbyterianism to Roman Catholicism. So, sneaking this one in here, I've been meaning to do it for over a week now and finally had the chance. So, here we are. Now, what we're doing is we're going to go over, apart from the writings of St. Augustine. And, anybody who's familiar with St. Augustine knows that he was involved in uh, writing against two major movements at the time, Pelagianism and Donatism. And it was especially Donatism that came with a view that said that the true Catholic Church, well, it had effectively become corrupt because it was very lax in its disciplines, and it was admitting people to the sacraments and priesthood who were lax in their worship of God and maybe have committed grave sins, though they may have repented later on. So the Donatists effectively set up a schismatic church apart from the Catholic Church, and they claim to be the true church. But of course, the actual real Catholic Church saw them as in schism. So St. Augustine is writing against them. But what it comes out from the anti-Donatist writings from St. Augustine is a few very interesting points, and I think some of these often get overlooked, especially when it comes to discussions about salvation outside of the Catholic Church. Now, very technically speaking, there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church, as I've said many times in many videos, and I have an entire lecture I did on the history of outside the church. There is no salvation. There is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. But of course, the question is, could somebody be a member of the Catholic Church without actually being a card-carrying Catholic, right? Without being a formal member? Could they be an implicit member, if you will? Well, this is suggested by St. Augustine, very interestingly, because he is going to say that somebody could receive grace, not just valid sacraments. Hear me now. Not just valid sacraments, but actual grace, salvific grace, not some other kind of grace, salvific grace, outside of the Catholic Church in a schismatic church. You heard me right. I'm going to show that. St. Augustine believed that. He also believed that you could go to the same group and not receive grace. You could validly receive baptism, for example, from a Donatist schismatic. And though you might have a valid baptism, you could be putting in the impediment of schism between yourself and the Catholic Church if you intended schism. And in that case, you would not receive grace whenever you were baptized by the schismatic. You would have been given the grace. God gives you the grace, but you did not receive it, if you will. You were given the present, but you didn't open it up. You didn't unwrap it. Because you put an impediment between yourself and the Catholic Church and God, effectively. That is schism. But somebody who, out of necessity, not intending schism in their heart, but out of necessity, is not able to go to a Catholic church, and so they go to a schismatic Donatist church, for example, and receive the sacraments there. Augustine says they not only have validly received it, but even the graces. Just think about that for a moment. Think about that for a moment. What kind of implications might that have then on our ecclesiology? Once that starts developing and you take that to its logical conclusion, you end up with effectively Lumen Gentium, properly understood, not Lumen Gentium misunderstood, but Lumen Gentium properly understood. You also end up with some things that Trent talked about, baptism of desire, for example, the desire of sacraments. Even if you're not able to obtain the sacraments, you could still receive their graces through the desire of those sacraments. That's the Council of Trent. So a lot of these developments we see there in the second millennium, they're there implicitly in the first millennium, and they are the logical conclusion of especially figures like St. Augustine. This is from his book, Against the Donatists, on baptism against the Donatists. This is book 1, chapter 2. I'm going to read the entire section to y'all. Let's see. Okay. And so the Donatists in some matters are with us, in some matters have gone out from us. Accordingly, those things wherein they agree with us, we do not forbid them to do. But in those things in which, let's see, in those things in but in those things in which they differ from us, we earnestly encourage them to come and receive them from us, or return and recover them, as the case may be. And with whatever means we can, we lovingly busy ourselves that they, freed from faults and corrected, may choose this course. Here it is. We do not therefore say to them, abstain from giving baptism, but abstain from giving it in schism. Nor do we say to those whom we see them on the point of baptizing, do not receive baptism, but do not receive it in schism. Y'all hearing that, Eastern Orthodox? That applies to you as well. For if anyone were compelled by urgent necessity, now notice what he's saying here. He's talking about somebody who's now compelled because of necessity, not because of some kind of choice. They just don't like their local Catholic church, but out of necessity. For if anyone were compelled by urgent necessity, being unable to find a Catholic from whom to receive baptism, and so while preserving Catholic peace in his heart, so they're not intending schism. They intend to keep peace with the Catholic Church, but they're just unable to go to a Catholic church for one reason or another, physically or morally, whatever. Should receive from one without the pale of Catholic unity the sacrament. So he's talking about this person out of necessity, not intending schism, but they go to somebody who is in schism to receive a sacrament, which was intending to receive within its pale. This man, should he immediately depart this life, we deem to be none other than a Catholic. If he were to depart from this life at that moment, we deem him to be a Catholic. He not only has received the sacrament validly, but he's received the grace. He's actually a Catholic. If he had departed from this life, he truly is within God's embrace. How can St. Augustine say that? If St. Augustine believed that no grace, no salvific grace could ever be attained outside of formal membership in the Catholic Church, how could he say that? He says, but if he should be delivered from the death of the body on his restoring himself in bodily presence to that Catholic congregation from which in heart he had never departed, so he didn't intend schism, but he just doesn't have anywhere else to go to receive the sacraments. So far from blaming his conduct, we should praise it with the greatest truth and confidence, because he trusted that God was present to his heart while he was striving to preserve unity and unwilling to depart this life without the sacrament of holy baptism, which he knew to be of God and not of men, wherever he might find it. But if anyone who has it in his power to receive baptism within the Catholic Church prefers from some perversity of mind to be baptized in schism, even if he afterwards bethinks himself to come to the Catholic Church because he is assured that there the sacrament will profit him, which can indeed be received but cannot profit elsewhere, beyond all question he is perverse and guilty of sin, and that the more flagrant in proportion as it was committed willfully. For that he entertains no doubt that the sacrament is rightly received in the church is proved by his conviction that it is there he must look for profit even from what he has received elsewhere. So he's talking about two different people, two different individuals who receive the sacrament of baptism and presumably other sacraments outside of formal membership from a schismatic minister. The guy who doesn't intend schism in his heart, but out of necessity, this is the only place he can receive the sacraments from because they are valid, but they are in schism, but he doesn't intend schism, but he has to go there. There's nowhere else. That man, if he were to depart from this life, is a Catholic. You heard that from St. Augustine, not me. St. Augustine. He was the one who said it. If you don't like some of the developments that have been happening in the second millennium, especially in the last 500 years, when it comes to how we understand outside the church, there is no salvation. If you don't like those, your problem ultimately is with figures like Jesus, but also church fathers like St. Augustine. So these things are definitely there in St. Augustine, and it's just unpacked, and the applications of those are developed throughout the years. But I want you to notice how strong he is. Now, he again makes it clear somebody who is intending schism or doesn't have to go to the schismatic and receives the sacraments from them, they might have validly received them, but they don't receive the grace. They're perverse because they put an impediment between themselves and God and themselves in the grace of the sacrament. This is very important. This is extremely important when it comes to these discussions about outside the Catholic Church. There is no salvation. That is true. That is true. But there is grace outside of the formal boundaries of the Catholic Church. And this is why we talk about full communion, partial communion. This is why we talk about separated brethren, properly understood, not in a perverse and distorted sense, but properly understood. All of these concepts are not profane, they're traditional, and they are consistent with what has been developing for a very, very long time, not only from the patristic era, but especially since the discovery of the New World. So I hope this was helpful to y'all. Let me know your comments, your thoughts, all that good stuff. I wanted to sneak in a quick show here. If y'all have some questions, maybe shoot them my way. Send it to @Reason and Theology. I got just a few minutes. I'll take some of those, and then we are going to be doing our other show here in just a moment. That will be in about 25 minutes, where we're going to have a conversion story. So be really fun to do that. I always enjoy those shows, but yeah, go ahead and send me a couple. And I'll definitely do my best to answer them. By the way, y'all, if y'all haven't seen it already, go and watch the video that I did on the Council of Trent and Baptism of Desire. Go and watch that one. And also go and watch the video that I did. There was a lecture on the history of outside the Catholic Church, there is no salvation. Go and watch that one as well. I even go through Lumen Gentium line by line on that one. Could this be applied to the Orthodox? The same thing applies to the Orthodox. Absolutely. Absolutely. If an Eastern Orthodox does not intend schism, they could, not saying they will, they could receive God's grace when they receive the sacraments. If they are intending schism, in other words, if there is a formal aspect to their schism, I don't care how valid their sacraments are, it's perverse. They do not receive grace. They receive a greater condemnation and judgment. Now, ultimately, God is able to discern who is a material schismatic only and who is a formal schismatic. I can't really determine those things. It's hard enough judging my own heart. And I'm sure everybody listening to this would agree. It's hard enough judging our own hearts, let alone somebody else's. So I really try to refrain from making specific judgments on individuals. It's really hard to discern whether or not they're formal schismatic. I leave that to God. What I do is I don't ever say, "Hey, it's you're fine. You might just be a material schismatic, not intending schism. It's okay. It's all right." No, I warn them, you're in a dangerous place. Could be that there's some kind of exception here and there's no form to your schism. Maybe, but I don't want to assume that. You're in a dangerous position. You need to come into full communion with Catholic Church and receive the sacraments there, because you're receiving them in a very dangerous setting. Same applies to the Eastern Orthodox. Then even more so to the Protestants, because they don't have all of the sacraments at that point, whereas the Orthodox do. So again, the same thing that St. Augustine just said here could be said to the Eastern Orthodox. Could be receiving it in grace. They might not be receiving it in grace. Depends on the element of intention when it comes to schism. That's ultimately the criteria that Augustine was using, and that's effectively the criteria that's being used here when it comes to Eastern Orthodox. And that's often overlooked in these discussions. I hear it so many times. Well, the Orthodox have valid sacraments, blah, blah, blah. Sure, That's true. But just because you have valid sacraments doesn't mean you're automatically receiving them rightly. I mean, Catholics, we have valid sacraments too. Does that mean we're always receiving them rightly? No, I mean, I'm sure there's quite a few Catholics out there who are receiving valid sacraments in mortal sin. So just because you have valid sacraments doesn't mean you're receiving them properly. And the same applies to Eastern Orthodox. And the added element here is that not only do they have the same weaknesses that we might have, but they also have the added element of potentially schism. So I think that's often forgot when it comes to these discussions with Eastern Orthodox, and we really need to keep that in mind. Let's see if I find anything else. Wine show, I see your question, a show idea there. Yeah, I think we could do that. Make short clips of longer streams. Yeah, I've done that. I've spent hours doing all that, and those don't get any more views than the actual real videos anyway. And the amount of time that I put in editing these videos isn't worth it. So I don't do the short clips thing. Most of the people who do the short clips thing, either that's because they do YouTube full time, which I don't, because I have a day job, or they hire a company who does that for them. And I don't have either one of those. I can't afford that $3,000 a month to pay one of these companies to do it. Or I can't sit here and edit footage all day long and upload it and stuff like that. Doing the snippets like that is a great idea. I like it, but I've tried it before. It takes too long, and the results didn't seem proportionate to the time I invested. So it might be a while before we do that. Um, did you always find Protestant worship music cringe, or did that happen after you became Catholic? Always, always found it cringe. Always, always. I've never liked that. God bless the people who like that style of music. I mean, if that's what you like listening to outside of the liturgy, okay, that's fine. It's not an issue for me. Now during the liturgy, I don't think any of that should be played. Guitar music, all that, I don't think that's the most suitable. I'm not saying it's wrong or evil. I just don't think it's the most fitting. In the Latin Rite, I think Gregorian chant and things to that effect is most suitable. It doesn't mean that it's the only option and everything else is evil. It's just the most fitting. And I don't think we should trade what is most fitting for something less fitting. I don't see the reason to do it. Same if we're going to an Eastern liturgy, assuming it's a Byzantine one. I think the Byzantine tradition and it Byzantine chants and things like that. That's what should be used there. I don't think that we should have rap, hip hop, rock and roll, whatever. I don't think that's suitable and fitting for the liturgy. But again, outside of the liturgy, assuming there's no profanity and profane topics being discussed, I don't have a problem with somebody listening to those different kinds of things. Now, I know there have been some priests who have made arguments about certain sounds being evil, but I don't necessarily buy into that view. But um, I I don't really have a problem with somebody who listens to that kind of stuff outside of liturgy, but oh man, in the liturgy, no, definitely not. But personally, I've always it's just not my kind of music. For me, I, if somebody's playing that kind of stuff in the car with them, I would rather jump out of the car than sit in there and listen to it. I'm sorry, I can't do it. It's too much, especially the more um what's the word I'm looking for? There are these kind of songs that you hear in some quarters of Protestantism, not all of them, but some quarters of Protestantism, where it almost sounds like love music, but it's being addressed to Jesus. In my opinion, it's entirely inappropriate. It sounds to me like a song that one could write to their spouse, but they just replace the name of their spouse with the name of Jesus, and they present that as praise and worship music. To me, that's not appropriate. I don't think that's right. So no, to answer your question, this has been long before I was Catholic. I don't really like that kind of stuff. Interesting question. Let's see if there was anything else I could spot in the chat. Um, so does intending schism mean that they know Catholicism exists and what it claims or refuse to enter it, or is it a bit different? It is a bit different. This is one of the things that's being discussed in the 1500s because the question now is we come to the New World and we're preaching the gospel to the Native Americans, but we're also scandalizing them. You'll see different theologians who are saying, yeah, y'all are going out, you missionaries, y'all are going out and preaching the gospel to these people, but then you're scandalizing them, committing all kinds of horrible acts of sin. And of course, they're not embracing the gospel. Of course, they're not listening to what you have to say. You're scandalizing these people. And they'll talk about, I've heard reports of y'all doing this and this and this. So then they go on to note it's not good enough that they just hear the truth of the gospel. They need to actually be convinced of their claims for them to have culpability. The Native Americans just simply having heard the truth of Christ, but then seeing all these scandals, that's not enough to bring about culpability for the Native Americans, according to these theologians. You can see this in the Salamancan school, for example. What they were saying is when it's being preached genuinely with good character and morals of life, now that's something else. That might bring about some culpability if they reject that. So it's not. So the point is, it's not just that they've heard the message, but that it's been preached convincingly enough, at least. Um, and I would say that's not the case in when it comes to many people. They haven't heard Catholicism being preached and taught in a convincing way. I know they haven't. I used to be one of them, so I know for a fact they haven't. But I'd heard of the claims before that the Catholic Church thinks it's the only true church, blah blah blah. I'd heard these things, but I'd never heard any good reason to believe it. So when it comes to inculpability and putting form to schism, you have to have that element that it's been presented to you convincingly, and you still reject it. Very good question. Let's see if there's anything else. I didn't see the Ramsey and Ortland discussion, so I can't comment on it. What percentage of similarities are there between Orthodox and Catholics? Are we talking about substantial similarities, or are we just talking about accidental similarities? If we're talking about substantially, and it depends on which Orthodox. So I would say if we're talking matters of substance, and we're talking about the best group that Orthodox have to offer, there's not a whole lot of differences. There are some fundamental differences still. Papal supremacy and papal infallibility. That's with the best of Orthodox. There still are a few essential elements that are lacking, but on the whole, there's still a pretty large, substantial amount. The vast majority, we would be in agreement substantially. Accidentally, we have some differences for sure, even with the best Orthodox. But we have that within the Catholic Church too, so that's not an issue. Um, but with the worst that Orthodoxy has to offer, yeah, we might be lower in the numbers there. We might have some serious substantial differences because now you start to get into the guys who deny think that the filioque is heresy, think that the Immaculate Conception is abhorrent, think that original sin is not part of the apostolic tradition, and so on and so forth. So you start running into those people, you run into a whole lot more issues. So let's see. What do I think of Eastern Catholic churches that imitate the ordinary form? I'm not necessarily in favor of that. I think it's best to try to not blend the two. Although I will say some of the liturgical reforms of Sacrosanctum Concilium were not just for the Latin Rite; they were also for the Eastern churches. So as long as we are properly recognizing some of those reforms, even though I might not necessarily agree with all the reforms, I think that you could still allow for some developments in the Eastern tradition, but I wouldn't want to go too far with that. I think that some of those differences show the beauty of the Catholic Church, but I also think some of the differences with the Eastern Catholics is are more preferable to some of the things that we find in the Latin Rite. So there are some things in the Eastern traditions that I think are more preferable than our traditions, um, such as the reversing of the order of the sacraments, delaying confirmation until somebody's 15 years old, separating chrismation from baptism, separating the Eucharist from chrismation and baptism, abolishing infant communion for absolutely no good reason. The only reasons why you could ever muster up against infant communion are the same exact reasons I would use to then argue against infant baptism. So I don't I think there are some aspects to the Eastern traditions that are more preferable. So I wouldn't want to see them becoming too Latin. Um, time is it? Let's see. Well, I got to go here in just a second. Let's see if I can take one more. Um, in the age of YouTube, can anyone? This is a good question. Philosophy of the desert. In the age of YouTube, can anyone with the internet be invincibly ignorant? It's a really good question. It really is. Yeah, I would say yes, it's still possible. Not everybody watches all of this stuff, right? So they might have the ability to access these things, but it might be such that it's not with great ease. They don't know where to go. In other words, I know some people right now, they they have access to YouTube. They have access to the internet, but they wouldn't know where to go. They wouldn't know how to use the internet. They would if they knew how to use it, they wouldn't know where to go on YouTube and what are the odds of them then finding good content that is convincing. So, yeah, and then you have quite a few people who don't have internet access at all, and so there's quite a few people in the world who still don't have these things. So when it comes to culpability, invincible ignorance pertains to people who are ignorant of something and they could not easily dispel that ignorance. And I think that that still pertains to a fair amount of people. As to which individual that specifically pertains to, I don't know. I'll let God be the judge. My duty is to go and preach the truth and tell the truth to people and urge them to come to the truth. My duty is never to assume somebody is invincibly ignorant. I think that we should never assume that. You never want to assume that. You always want to assume that they are in danger and need to hear the truth, and you present the truth to them. All right. Well, I appreciate the questions. Very good questions there, y'all. And we'll try to do another one tomorrow before the 6 o'clock stream. So we'll pick it back up with some more. But again, let me know your thoughts, your comments, your questions. Put them in the comment section whenever this posts on YouTube. And of course, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, hit the bell for notification of future shows that are coming up. Also, check us out, patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support us. Also get access to extra content. And stay tuned because in about 10 minutes we have another show coming up. So y'all look for that on your notifications. See y'all in just a few. God bless.